This is Kathy Anderson, photographer with the Times-Picayune newspaper in New Orleans. In my 25-year newspaper career, I have never heard something as piercingly eerie as the sound of the hurricane wind the morning that Katrina hit landfall in New Orleans. I waited inside the newspaper building in downtown New Orleans until the wind would allow me to venture out to photograph what the storm had left behind. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, I would find myself dead center in history being made. Being a journalist had never been as important or as difficult. I've worked through the debris, the sour stench, the sauna heat, and the moldy mess photographing what is left of New Orleans. I've stared into the sadness of our city, and some days it stares back. Hours after the storm subsided, I photographed looters, fallen telephone poles, and people wading through waist-deep water. The following morning I climbed up the dark, spiraling staircase of the tower that sits on top of the third floor of our building. Through the lens, I saw people walking on the interstate in the direction of the battered Superdome. Others stopped in their tracks less than a block from a pumping station, which was now surrounded by at least 4 feet of water. A fire raged out of control in the distance. Frame by frame, I witnessed the city drowning. Over the next several weeks, I would hang out of the side of military helicopters, drive through the city in Army Humvees, and ride in airboats down very familiar thoroughfares, sometimes hearing a bump as the boat passed over the top of a car. I would sleep in an air hangar amidst hundreds of cots occupied by Army National Guard soldiers and experience my first and then dozens of subsequent MRE meals. The first couple of weeks after Hurricane Katrina reminded me of what I'd witnessed in 1985 when the newspaper sent me to Colombia, South America to cover the aftermath of a massive volcano eruption where thousands of people were killed. The sound of helicopters whirling overhead was deafening as they searched for survivors, but found very few. I had to wear a mask while working so I wouldn't have to smell the stench. I watched in horror as a dog slowly chewed the arm of a corpse that lay in the mud. This place is ruined, I thought to myself. Fast forward 2 decades to the last few days of August 2005, and once again I heard the whirl of helicopters and wore a mask over my face while looking through the lens at horrific destruction. This place is ruined, I thought to myself again. The big difference in the 2 assignments is that I got to fly home after the first one. Katrina lives with me every single day. It has changed me in so many ways, making me a better journalist, and in other ways a more fragile person. My children, ages 8 and 10, would live 1,000 miles away with their cousins, where they were protected from the nightmare called New Orleans. This time of separation has become a part of my own family's history. By mid-October, my husband and I moved into our house with no electricity and no gas. There was mold growing up from the floorboards in the kitchen. This was no place for children, I thought to myself as I walked through the house with a flashlight. In fact, there were very few children in the city. 1,000 miles north, the girls were learning the geography of Wisconsin and experiencing winter for the first time. Over the next several months, I would learn a lesson about the strength of family, the malleability of my children, and the kindness of strangers. Once the water subsided in October of 2005, I was able to venture into familiar area and check on things I know. Someone once told me that you can't make good pictures if you're crying. I kept telling myself this as I peered into the viewfinder at chaotic piles of pews that had been thrown around St. Paul's Episcopal Church by 9 feet of water. My mind kept flashing back to the recital 10 months earlier when my then 9-year-old daughter, Alyssa, played a perfect minuet and trio on the baby grand piano that now lie in shambles among the pews. For 4 years I had started out the day sitting on one of those pews, listening to the opening chapel that began the school day for my children. I was confirmed as an Episcopal in front of that altar. My friend Mary's funeral was at this church. Now there was concern that her ashes interred in a wall at the front of the church were mixed in with the ashes of others. This was not the first time I cried as I photographed the ruins of my city, and it certainly would not be the last. With all the contractors and FEMA workers in the city near the end of the hurricane year, men outnumbered women in New Orleans what seemed like 10 to 1. Most of the wives and children of my male co-workers were living out of town. There were only a few mothers of young children working at the newspaper. Some had already left to be with their kids. I felt like I was living in wartime. At first I couldn't walk into my daughter's bedroom at all because it was too sad to be in a place frozen in time. 5:30 p.m., August 28th. There were half-open drawers, unmade beds, and stuffed animals that didn't make it into the evacuation bag. Soon I found the house too sad to be in alone, so I stopped coming home when my husband worked late, sometimes sitting for hours in my car in a dark parking lot. There is an irony of having a house while so many had none, yet not finding the emotional wherewithal to step foot into it. Weekends were spent studying the Ninth Ward with my camera. Somehow it looked like how I felt. In the end, I put a series of photographs together as an essay entitled The Ways of Water. The only time I felt normal was when I was photographing the destruction. I wrote and photographed a story called Pieces of Us. It's an essay that takes a close look at what was lost to the storm: a mud-covered doll, a trophy without a head, a moldy wedding picture. When I talked to a homeowner about the mud-covered doll on the floor, he told me that his 3-year-old daughter was most concerned. "The dolls can't swim," she told her father. By November 2005, our house had electricity but no gas. That meant no hot water, no stove, and no clothes dryer. The drive to work each morning looked like a war zone. Collapsed buildings, molding cars, 5-foot debris piles. A boat rested in the middle of the street. And then on the return home at night, there was total darkness for miles. Where are all the people, I would ask myself? We were still the only people living on the block. Many nights I would wake up because I had been crying in my sleep. At the office, I was amazed that we put out a paper at all. Every single one of my coworkers experienced some sort of turmoil in their lives. My boss in the features section lost his home and everything he owns, yet never stopped working. The editor that sits across from me was rescued by helicopter from a second-floor balcony 5 days after the storm. It was understood that if your contractor called you on your cell phone during a meeting, it was okay to leave the meeting and take the call. The dedication of those around me was inspiring. On January 15, 2006, my husband and I flew to Wisconsin to bring our children home. There were great goodbyes at school with many gifts and many tears. When we finally pulled onto our block, 3 of the neighborhood children that had returned from Virginia and Houston stood with welcome home signs. They ran alongside the car screaming like maniacs until we pulled into the driveway, where doors were opened to hugs. A giggling gaggle of girls remained in the backyard the rest of the day and into the night. Even after the grand reunion, we questioned our decision to bring children here. Were we making the right decision bringing them back into this molding, desolate, seemingly hopeless city? Many families with young children were leaving the city. It's a question I have yet to answer. In the early part of 2006, every story I photographed and wrote was still about Katrina. Even the Mardi Gras and Jazz Fest stories were laced with some aspect of the hurricane. In March of that year, I was standing in what was left of the living room of 89-year-old Irwin Buffett for a story on how Katrina affects the elderly. The skin on his arm felt baby soft when he rested his arm on mine to steady himself. I lost my home, I lost my car, and all of my friends have moved away, the frail man told me. He was a photographer who had lost every negative he ever created. The backs to his 4x5 cameras were encrusted in mud on the floor. At 89, he could see no future. Looking at the image when I returned to the office, I thought of the thousands of others like him and how little I could do to make it any better. After seeing the photo in the newspaper, a contractor offered to gut the man's house. A photograph had made a difference. 10 months later, Mr. Buffett's daughter was standing several feet from her father's casket. "My father died of a broken heart," she told me. "Katrina did this to him," she said. In mid-June, I stopped to make a picture of kids playing in a blow-up swimming pool. In a normal town, this would be everyday wild art. This pool is on a concrete slab where a house stood before the hurricane destroyed it. Next to the house is a trailer where the children now live. When I asked their father what happened to his house, he tells me that he doesn't know. He never found it. It took a full year to get a telephone landline in my house. My life insurance was canceled because the post office kept sending the bill to the wrong address. The leak in our roof and the holes in the side of our house caused by the hurricane will not be repaired until we come to an understanding with the insurance company. In early 2007, rats crawled into those holes and lived inside the walls of our home, oftentimes waking me at night. Photographers who live in this city live the story they document. There really is no us and them. We are all clumped into one group called Katrina survivors. Every day history unfolds in New Orleans. No one really knows what will happen to this city. One thing is certain. Being a photojournalist continues to be as important as it has ever been.